Curve fitting is the boogeyman of backtesting. It's the enemy we must know how to spot and recognize in order to avoid losing money on unrealistic strategies. But behind the mask, what actually is curve fitting and how does it look? We must know how the enemy looks to avoid losing our hard-earned money. Here's how to spot and recognize when you have potentially curve fitted. I'm unbiased trading, and let's get straight into this. Curve fitting is the over-optimization of a trading strategy on historical data. This means that the strategy has been fine-tuned to fit the historical data that it is tested on, meaning it won't perform well on general data such as live markets or out-of-sample data. Curve fitting happens when we are too focused on creating a perfect-looking backtest. We may add more and more filters to remove all the fluctuations and downturns in the strategy's performance. This is essentially torturing the data to give us the result we want. But a backtest is an approximation. It is not a perfect representation of how the strategy will perform in live markets. No strategy is perfect. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses. Some strategies will have liquidity constraints, some will have wide risk, and some will have high equity curve volatility, meaning very high drawdowns and peaks. Now, what are some common causes for curve fitting? First is normally using too many variables in a strategy. For me personally, if I'm going over 10 variables, I'm starting to get worried that I'm probably overfitting. Most of the time, and from everyone I've talked to that's quite systematic in their trading, the simpler the better. So I try and aim for around 4 to 6 variables in a strategy. It will depend based on the market, the type of strategy, and things like that. But normally we only want 4 to 6 variables that we are somewhat optimizing, and the rest are very general, very broad, not very specific or anything like that. Next is a common issue for a lot of traders, and I see this a lot on Twitter, is changing the parameters of a strategy too often. Just because you've lost for a week and you've had 5 red days doesn't mean that your strategy needs to change in any way, such as parameters or adding new filters. Now, I will say there's some caveats to this. Sometimes if there's a new thing you've noticed that if you add this filter, you remove a lot of tail risk, then that is, very useful, and that's quite a good addition. But a lot of the time I'll see people, lose 3 times on something that has X kind of parameter. And then they're like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to move my parameter up so I avoid all those in the future. Now, realistically, most of the time that just leads to overfitting of all your parameters and will make your strategy work very well on historical data or in hindsight, but won't make it work well in the long term when you're trading on live data. Now, this is the constant balance with backtesting and, robustness testing and actually taking something live. Always live is most important, but we have a very good approximation of how a strategy should perform if we've seen it on that historical data. Next is using a small sample size of historical data. A lot of traders simply use, 30, 50 trades, and most of the time they haven't even used code to fully accurately backtest over those, 30 to 50 trades. Now, there's nothing wrong with starting out like that. I personally did as well, but there are some major caveats to that. Most of the time, you're going to lead to human error and human bias, and you're not going to have a big enough sample size to actually have it to be statistically significant, which means pretty much your results don't really matter most of the time. You really want above 200 samples if possible, with, the best being like 1,000 samples, for example. But most of the time, there aren't many strategies you can get 1,000 samples of. So most of the time, 200, at least for me and for other people I've spoken to, has been a good kind of rough number. Next is the endless optimization of a strategy. If you are constantly going through different variations of that particular strategy on the same historical data, you will find the perfect result, but you won't find good live performance. This is the classic fool everyone falls into, really. Most of the time, they're going over 10 different variations of the same setup on the same 2 years of data, and you will find the best results, but that won't be the best live results because you're just overfitting it to have a perfect picture on your historical data. Next is believing that correlation equals causation. Now, this one's really tough. There isn't actually, even from great people like Ernest Chan, which is an amazing quant trader, there isn't so much a solution to this, and sometimes it can be hard to tell. But a lot of the time, there's many, many, many reasons why something is happening in the market, and there's also a degree of randomness as well. So sometimes people overestimate how much a parameter is causing this particular result in a ticker. And sometimes it's actually something completely different, but you're just kind of lining up to where it kind of makes the same result, if that makes sense. So try and be cautious that you don't over leverage or overthink that one parameter is causing this whole result. Now, there are, some classic ones that make a lot of sense, like a gap percentage. A high gap percentage does create a higher probability of it closing red and fading. The reason for this is most of the time it's an inefficient move, which actually isn't very a fair price for that particular ticker. Now, there's other events like this, and those can be quite correlated and actually have a causation. But other times, people think like if it's really low float, it's gonna, just go haywire. That isn't normally what happens. On a just data point perspective, if you have less than 1 million float, it's actually pretty much the same odds as if you have over 1 million floats. So sometimes things like that can get misconstrued where people believe, low float equals huge squeeze. It's kind of other factors coming in play with it as well. Next is how can we avoid curve fitting? Now, there are a few things that we can do to avoid curve fitting. One of them is to do robustness testing. So like Monte Carlos, out of sample testing, parameter sensitivity testing, and also making sure that we have a simpler strategy compared to a more complex one. This involves testing the strategy under different market conditions with different data sets as well. Another one is to use a small number of variables in the strategy. And finally, we should avoid changing the parameters of the strategy too often. Normally, I'm looking to change my strategy parameters every maybe 6 months, maybe most of the time I don't really change them that too much. Sometimes they'll change based on a cycle. I'll maybe add a bit of discretion into there as I'm sort of a hybrid trader sometimes for small caps. But most of the time I'm not making, decisions based on the week or based on a couple days or even really a month. Most of the time that's too small for me. Now, 97% of traders don't do any sort of testing, and most really heavily curve fit their strategies. This is normally a recipe for disaster, and if you want to avoid bad strategies and learn how to do robust backtesting, I encourage you to join the September 1st How to Backtest Bootcamp that I'm running right now. It is at the best price it will ever be at. It has always been more expensive previously, and it will always be more expensive after this. I'm doing kind of like a last run for a couple, just for September, and then I probably won't run it again for at least a couple months, as I'm just busy with some other projects. So if you do want to get serious about your backtesting and, focused on small caps, large caps, a bit of futures as well, and generate an edge in the market, I'd really recommend joining. We've had over 40 plus traders and they've all found it very useful. So I hope to see you in there. I'll leave the link in the description. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed, please like it and share it with anyone else who might be interested.